here. I'm thankful that we're not in Texas this morning and we're not lost in the snow or stuck in a snowbank or still trying to get out of our driveways. So that's progress. And we're going to dig in this morning looking at where we left off last week. We left off with the great crash and things become more serious last week. And as we saw, the chapter called Things Become More Serious take us almost hour by hour and certainly day by day from the first days of crash, October 24 to 29. The big crash was October 29. And then taking us through November 13 and showing day by day and week by week what happened. And I enjoy Galbraith's kind of ironic tone where he shows that the organized enthusiasm is trying again and again to reassure the public. And as he says at the end of that chapter, it seems like everybody was reassured except the public. So as soon as they think they have it fixed by being cheerful enough, it goes down again. And then in the midst of that, it will have certain up days. So by the end of that chapter, looking at 127,
Linda, let me know when you want me to share a screen. Do you want it up now?
Go ahead and share that first screen,
Okay.
number 21, or 20, I guess. All right, so we have organized enthusiasm going on, and here we have John D. Rockefeller himself, who then, as now, was known throughout the country. And he issued a statement that he and his son were buying, which did have the effect of encouraging people for a short time after Rockefeller said that he and his son were buying. But Galbraith is describing this period as the first phase as the slaughter of the innocents. And he mentions that a pool of bankers was actively selling and shorting their stocks while urging the innocents to have faith. Then Lamont, another one of the bank dignitaries that you saw mentioned in here, denies that he's selling, but says that it's not the purpose of banks to support the market. That's the reverse of what he had said just at an earlier time. In the first dip of the market, Lamont had said that, oh, the banks would get together and support the market. Now he's saying, no, it's not the function of a bank to support the market. It's just to give an orderly process to the buying and selling that you all do. Albert Wiggins says, he's short millions when he says the group of bankers has not been a seller of stocks. Flat out lie. New York Stock Exchange is self-governed at this point and subject to no important federal regulation. And that's an important point that he makes along the way here, because as a result of the crash of 29, that's going to change, as we all know, and we'll get to that later in the session. October 31, Rockefeller's statement produces a sudden rise. Believing that fundamental conditions of the country are sound, my son and I have for some days been purchasing sound common stocks. By the time Galbraith gets finished quoting all these financial gurus and experts, he's used the word fundamental all the time. And finally, he says at the end of the chapter, whenever you hear someone say that things are fundamentally sound, you know that something is fundamentally wrong. You know something's wrong when somebody comes on and says things are fundamentally sound. Let's go to the next slide. Now, here are the things he mentions that happened on October 29 to try to convince the public that everything was going to be fine, or to try to create fixes. Companies that were on the market boosted their dividends. Well, that has nothing to do with what the underlying stock is doing. A dividend is just a pronouncement that they're going to distribute some profits. They shut the markets just before Rockefeller made his statement coming on the wires. There was a big rally on Wednesday because that first shutdown had been a Tuesday. No one knows why, says Galbraith. No one knows why that sudden rally took place. Then they hit Thursday, October 31, 7 million shares trade, which is a new high for the number of shares. There are market gains. Brokers' loans dropped by over $1 billion. In other words, people are reducing the margin borrowing. Anyone who has the money to pay off their margin loans is doing so, and those brokers' loans are going down, or they're managing to sell their stocks, and that's erasing a margin loan. Margin loans are cut to 25%. That means that you could borrow up to 25% of the stock. You would have to pay out of your own money for 75% of the stock, but you still could borrow 25% of what you were buying. The Fed rate, the rate that the Federal Reserve Bank charges to commercial banks to borrow the money, was dropped from 6% to 5% so that more money can flow into the market, some of it going into margin loans. And to ease money rates and supply more credit, that's why these interest rates are being moved down just by pronouncement. Then Galbraith, again sounding kind of comical, on these happy portents, the market closed down for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I'm sorry, the markets were closed. I don't mean they went down. They made these happy portents, and then they made those happy announcements, put out the dividends, cut the margin rate, and then closed the New York Stock Exchange to trading for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Meanwhile, at the stock exchanges, the workers caught up with delayed paperwork. Millions of trades had not been recorded and mistakes had been made, and they straightened that all out over the weekend by their workers working night and day, literally. We hit Friday, November. On Friday, November 1, the news was good. Friday, November 1, the news was good. Car prices were slashed, not by very much. I didn't think the discounts on car prices were cut that much, 3 to 5%. But at least you could save a few $100s if you wanted to buy a car that weekend. And Chase took 5 columns in the New York Times to claim that the 2-day rally had left the market fundamentally unimpaired. Then we come to Monday, November 4. That day, the market started another ghastly slump. In other words, the public wasn't buying it. Whoever the public was out there, all those 1.5 million people with their investments, didn't hold. The efforts to build confidence didn't hold. Over the weekend, the financial community had almost certainly been persuaded by its own organized and spontaneous efforts at cheer. The papers described the reaction of Wall Street to Monday's market, the big slump, in other words, as one of stunned surprise, disbelief, and shock. Lamont said, that banker expert said, he didn't know why everyone was cheerful except the public. Now, what's kicking in here is reverse leverage, which is an important point that we made, I think, last week, and was tremendously important in what was happening. Reverse leverage means what? Well, when you have one stock, you borrow against your one stock purchase, and then you borrow against that equity and buy some more stock on margin, and borrow against that equity and buy some more stock on margin, you are leveraging things. It's like a domino effect. And it's explained on page 123 in your book about how that works in reverse leverage. Next slide. Now, Galbraith makes an important point here because throughout this book, he is correcting the mythology that had grown up by 1955 about what had happened in the crash. And in particular, as we've mentioned, 2 things he's pointing out firmly. First of all, in the 1932 hearings that took place after the market had not come back, but was at least stabilized at its dismal levels, that only about 600,000 of the accounts held by speculators were for margin trading, and 950,000 were for cash accounts. In 950,000 of the 1.5 million accounts that were out there, something like, not quite 2/3 of them were cash accounts. Nobody was borrowing the money that they were losing. So only those few. And then he points out, as we said last week, that out of a population of 120 million, only 1.5 million people were in the market at all, directly or indirectly. And if we count it as households, then there were about between 20 and 30 million families, and only one family out of 30 would have any association with the stock market. So it leaves us puzzled about why our impression is that the effect was so drastic in the entire population when so few were actually in the market themselves. Well, now over in the right column, I've listed some of the ways that ordinary people then were going to suffer as an echo effect of what had happened in the market, or because of what happened in the market, plus other things that were taking place in the economy or in the country in those next 10 years. First of all, when the cash squeeze was on, when the squeeze was on in the market, local banks ended up closing for weeks, possibly months, because the federal government was not automatically supplying all the money that would be needed, so there would be no money squeeze. Holland, Michigan's banks closed. As we mentioned last week, people couldn't get their paychecks. The employers couldn't pay the wages, not because the money wasn't there on the books of the bank, but because the doors of the bank were closed. You couldn't get in to physically get the money. And that has now been corrected through the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which now is a way that the federal government makes sure that banks do not run out of money. They can still go bankrupt on the books. Bad things can happen. As a result of people not being able to get their wages, houses were lost. Meanwhile, we all know that on the farms of this country in the 30s, drought was occurring year after year. And so farmers could make it through a year with drought and have a bad crop, but they couldn't make it through year after year after year, just as today. Sometimes they had payments on their land, they had to support their families, they had to buy and maintain equipment. And so the effect on the American economy of farmers not being able to make it through 30 was very drastic, and possibly more drastic than the stock market. We don't know that it was directly related to the stock market. As a result of all this, children who were teenagers maybe had to drop out of school and work on the farm, or sometimes not go to school. School was required, but not every family did send their children to school if they were needed at home to carry on. As we saw, Hope College enrollment dropped by 15%. There were colleges that had much more severe drops in enrollment. Social Security does not yet exist. And fear itself creates a run on banks, so that if you think your bank is about to close, shut the doors, and you won't have access to your money, what will you do? Rush in there and take all your money out in cash before the bank can close. And that's what's called a run on the bank. The bank knows how much cash it has to have on a certain day as an average of who's putting money in and who's taking money out. They know those things, but now that's all completely destroyed and everybody wants their money in cash. Okay, next slide. Here on the left, we have the staff of the bank in Holland that was robbed in 1932. So as we all recall, this is the era of Bonnie and Clyde and other colorful stories of bank robbers and desperate ways that people were trying to make up what they had lost. So Holland had its own bank robbery in 1932, and here are the very people who had to endure that. Tulip time, as I said, goes on. This is the wooden shoe factory. That's a business that can never shut down. It's right here, and they could still get the wood. And tulip time, established in 1927, continued to draw crowds in the 1930s because people could come to tulip time for very little money. It didn't have to curb their desire to go somewhere and see beautiful tulips. Next slide. Now here's a lot of verbiage, but we're going to cover these points as well. Galbraith describes Gresham's Law, which says that when you have a bad investment, you sometimes drain your good investment to, try to fill the hole that was created by your bad deal. Once a borrower gets caught, creditors swamp him. So margin calls force panic sales. That's another way of putting Gresham's Law. You also had a trend of companies that were in trouble rushing in to buy in their own stock with the last cash that they had. They bought their own worthless stock, thinking that if they bought it in, then when it went up, they would make it all back. The autumn of 1929 was perhaps the first occasion when men succeeded on a large scale in swindling themselves. Now, a stock buy-in isn't always a sign that the company's in trouble. Berkshire Hathaway has bought in its own stock, and many of the most successful companies in America sometimes decide to buy in their own stock. But when it's a panic move to try to rescue a stock that's in a lot of trouble, then it's like swindling yourself. Tuesday, November 5 was election day.
Linda, may I make a comment?
Yeah.
The principal reason normally that companies buy their own stock back is if you pay out earnings to shareholders in dividends, it is taxed one way. If you buy back the stock and they have held the stock for a long enough period, the money that comes to the people that sell the stock is treated as a capital gain, and it is taxed at a lower rate. So it is much more advantageous to sell some stock than it is to have the company pay extra dividends if it has extra money. The tax laws make companies do something backward. Well, I shouldn't say they make them do it backward. The tax laws set up businesses doing it backward because it is a tax advantage to buy back stock, and it is a tax disadvantage to pay additional dividends.
Correct. So if you would be a person who doesn't want your dividends, I mean, you're saving this money for the future. You don't want to be paid out right now. It's your nest egg. You can't write to the company and say, well, don't send me any dividends this year. They don't have that choice. They send you the dividends and now they're taxable. So what George is saying is the answer that companies have is by buying in their own stock, they're doing what George just suggested, changing the tax treatment of the money that someone would take out by then selling some of the stock, and also helping those people who really are buy and hold, and they want it plowed back in. They want their dividends plowed back in effect, so that each share becomes more valuable. When you reduce the number of shares and the company's net worth is the same, each share automatically becomes more valuable when the company buys in some shares. So as George is saying, it has a good purpose, and there's nothing crooked about buying in shares of itself. And in many ways, it's a wise strategy. That's what you're saying, George, right?
Yes.
Now, a new result that Galbraith mentions was a collapse in commodities. What do we mean when we say commodities? Well, a physical thing that is bought and sold. Wheat, corn, soybeans, pork bellies, oil and gas. The commodities markets fell off sharply. Wheat drops vertically at noon. Now, why the commodities markets would be directly related to the stock markets, I'm not sure, but certainly a drastic change in the price of wheat is going to kill a lot of farmers. If they know now that they can't sell their wheat for what it costs them to grow the wheat, then that does create a crisis in agriculture. Do you have any comment, George, on the connection between the stock market and the commodities market?
No.
Okay. We don't have to go down that side path. November 7 and 8, a higher drop and a small drop, another weekend of contemplation. Galbraith is suggesting that when people have that Saturday and that Sunday to just be calm, the markets are closed, they have to take a walk or be with their families or look at nature or something, they become contemplative and they do automatically think things over. I can see a psychological reason why people make maybe more considered decisions or maybe more panicked decisions about what they're going to do on Monday. If you're a worrywart, then you get more worried on Friday, even more worried on Saturday, and terribly worried on Sunday. And on Monday, you do panic selling, or you have time to consult your better angels and decide what is the long-term best thing to do. The second tier of this crash is the special mark of the 1929 disaster. Galbraith points out the previous crashes that had occurred in the market. You know, remember the market started in way before 1873. There was a crash in 1873. There was a crash in 1908, and there was a crash in 1920. But they had been over just a crash and then a recover, having a recovery. When it had happened, they were over. See page 108 for more on that. It wasn't 1929 that did everybody in. It was the ongoing misery and fall, slight rise, big fall again, slight rise, big fall again of 1929 to 31 that crushed the national confidence and destroyed fortunes. Now the movement of money is pointed out. Galbraith has his eye on bankers. And in the end, in these two chapters, he's going to try to rescue the reputation of bankers. Because in 1932, when Congress looks this all over, of course they want scapegoats. They want to be able to send a couple of people to jail to prove that Congress really stepped in like a parent saying, none of this nonsense, and find the culprits and put them in jail to make the public feel something had been corrected. Out-of-town banks call $2 billion in money back home that they had lent to the New York banks in order to lend it then in turn to brokers. The New York bankers have to step in, and Galbraith points out that they did step in, that the New York bankers did step in when all of this money that had come from far and wide in the country was called back, and now they have to pony up. If they had not done so, a money panic would have been added to the other woes, he says, because owners could not have borrowed money at any price to carry them. So the New York bankers are making really good money now to cover all these margin loans. And of course, they can raise the rate that the investor has to pay anytime they want. So they're making good money on replacing the margin loans. Bankers for having prevented another layer of disaster that could have happened if they didn't have that vote of confidence and cooperate to cover all those loans in 1929. But bankers took a lot of blame in the aftermath, and that's described on 114 and 115. He says he has a very interesting description of bankers on page 115. He says a banker doesn't need to be popular. Indeed, a good banker in a healthy capitalist society should probably be much disliked. People do not wish to trust their money to a hail fellow well met, but to a misanthrope who can say no. A misanthrope is somebody who hates mankind. So is that a satire on bankers? No, I think he's making a serious point. Look at that picture we had of John D. Rockefeller back a couple of slides back. He looks very stern. He looks like, no nonsense. Don't come to me with your tales of woe. You know, no, I can't extend this mortgage. No, I'm not going to let you have extra time. You signed an agreement and you're going to have to stick to it, so forth. The bankers need not be popular. So when a banker gives you easy money in plush times, and perhaps talks you into buying something that you shouldn't be able to buy. And then when things go bad and you're in trouble and you come to ask for special terms, the banker says no. Is that right? Well, that's a moral question, and that's a challenge in capitalism. But mortgage lending is more controlled today than it has been at other times. Is it true that banks have no responsibility to support a falling market, but only to help make it orderly? Now, let me hear a couple comments on that from those of you who are thinking about this. Do banks have a responsibility to support a falling market? And then the partner question, does the government have a responsibility to rescue the losers in a marketplace? Does,
No, 1,000 times no.
okay, okay, all right. Does Galbraith agree that some banks are, quote, too big to fail? Let's get to that in a minute, but let's go back to George's comment, 1,000 times no. The government does not have a responsibility to rescue the losers in a marketplace. Okay, I agree with that too. I do agree that that's a foundation of our thinking about money.
It's bad enough that we bail out people, but we sure don't need to bail out institutions.
Okay, well, there was a lot of public outcry when certain companies considered too big to fail were, helped out by, I think it was the Tarp loans back in the crash in 2008. Now, what people don't know is that I believe it's true that those Tarp loans were very correctly and quickly paid back by the companies as they did recover and with interest. So the government did make money on it overall, and it did rescue them in the short term. So, but that, do you agree, George, that was an example of the government doing a huge bailout, but on terms that where the public did get their public money's worth?
The public didn't bail them out generally. They made sufficient bank liquidity available so that a company that had positive assets could borrow a large amount of money, like GM and Chrysler Fiat. They borrowed lots of money, but they still had a lot of assets on their balance sheet, but they just couldn't borrow the money against their balance sheet like they could in another time because the banks were unwilling to loan them the money without a federal guarantee.
All right, so the
But
bank,
they didn't give them the money.
yeah, okay. So the banks want the federal government to back it up. And because of that federal guarantee, if the bank winds up holding a piece of paper that's worthless on these companies that should have the assets, but if something goes wrong, they have Uncle Sam to rely on. Uncle Sam is going to step in and make it up to them. But in the case of the rescue of those companies, it didn't happen that Uncle Sam had to make it up to them. The loans were repaid with the interest that was due. So in that case, now in the mortgage market, we have federal guarantees of the mortgages that banks issue. So if the person who bought the house becomes unable to pay on the mortgage, and the mortgage is now, the house won't sell for the amount of the mortgage, that mortgage is still guaranteed by the federal government, as I understand it. If it's owned by Fannie Mae, for example, if they turn it over to Fannie Mae, then that mortgage is guaranteed by the government. So if someone bought a house for $75,000, this happened to me when I was a poor school teacher in Ohio, trying to supplement my poor salary by owning a rental home. I bought a house one time for $22,000. Now that house had been evaluated at $80,000. The person who owned it couldn't keep up with the payments. And it was in the wake of the 2008 housing crisis. So they foreclosed, the person moved out, the bank put the house on the market. The price, they started at $69,000, didn't sell. They went to $59,000 fairly soon, didn't sell. I'm watching it online because I own the house next door. It went to $49,000. It went to 39,000. It went to 29,000. And the bank was lowering that price about every 2 weeks. They were just leaving it for a limited period of time. If no buyers, they go down again. When it hit 29,000, I said to my husband, John, we need another house like a hole in the head, but we have to buy this house because it's next to a house that I owned and it's 29,000. So we called now this is all insured by the federal government. Why can the bank afford to close out a loan they made to that owner of about 70,000 and take only 29,000 for the house? Because if they have made a good faith effort to sell their house, which they did by putting it on a multiple listing and carrying it down and down, if they made a good faith effort to sell it and the market wouldn't support that, then the federal government is going to step in and make it up to the bank, so that even though the bank only gets what we paid for the house, the federal government pays them the rest of what they were short on the mortgage. Not to the homeowner, that doesn't happen, but to the bank that held the mortgage. Now that is a sense in which a federal guarantee is helping have an orderly market. But John and I stepped in and I said, well, I really, like I said, it was not a good time. We would never have bought that house, except I already owned the house next door. And if I let that house sell for 22,000 and it continues to look shabby like it looked, it affects the value of what I already own. So I had about 3 reasons to buy this. So John and I scraped together and bid 22,000. And our realtor said, oh, they'll never take 22,000. That's too low. And I said, try it. I said, try it. See, I'm Dutch, so I said, try it. And the bank took it. So here we bought this house for 22,000, made a few improvements to it to clean it up, put a fence in front of it, fix the landscaping, etc. Fix whatever was wrong. And we rented it for 2 years and then we sold it. And it was a very good investment, both as a rental and to sell. Now, that was an example of a federal loan taking care of the banker. The original homeowner had been extended quite a few times to see if he could get his act together and get back on track with the mortgage. It had been adjusted at least twice, but it did have to go into foreclosure. And George just said the federal government shouldn't step in and help the losers. So the federal government did not step in and buy the house for the original owner. But the federal government did step in and insure the bank's mortgage so that the bank could afford to make those mortgages. Now, what's going to be the outcome of that? Well, we all know that the crash in 2008 was largely related to the absolutely ridiculous number of mortgages that were issued to people who really could not afford those houses. And so where is the morality of this? Where is the right and wrong of this dramatic example of a house dropping down to 22, and then we, the speculators, buy it, go through. We made about 3 trips out there to Ohio to take care of this. And John and I were both working full-time, very busy, but we wanted to do this partly for the community to help that town rescue their poor, battered down real estate and, stay the town that it could be and was. So where is the right and wrong? Who does the federal government help? We benefited by taking risk, but were we taking risk? Well, I don't know, but I know one thing: we wouldn't have spent more than 22,000 on that house because we would had no sufficient reason to buy it. So this particular question is one we'll touch back on as we go forward, because I agree with George that the federal government should not help the losers in a marketplace. There's a meaning to saying, do this at your own risk. And that's true. So each individual, whether you're buying a, video game or a car or a house or a stock, you decide what you buy, and you are responsible if you incur debt in order to buy it. Next slide, let's move forward. Just be thinking about this, and anybody who has a comments, please speak up, because I think this is an important question that's coming out of this. Okay, so now we're going to look at homeschool and church life goes on. This photo is in 1927, and did I show you this last week? I don't recall. Anyway, if you look at the little kid in the striped shirt in the middle, you will see that he's holding his pet rat. So he has a loving mother, I'm sure. In Holland, factory jobs were cut back, but Heinz, Holland Shoe, and Holland Furnace, all important businesses in Holland at that time, did stay open. In churches and at Hope, salaries were cut. At Third Reformed, where I happen to know the history a little bit, and Hope Reformed, where Judy Parr is an expert on their history, pastors found their salaries cut to $2,500 a year from $4,000 at Third and $6,000 at Hope, respectively. At Third Reformed in 1932, 2,000 pounds of Red Cross flour were given out to poor families. Third Reformed ruled that Reverend Martin may no longer keep his wedding or funeral fees. Normally, those are the minister's fees. It's his time and it's kind of on the side. It isn't expected that that goes back to the church. But the consistory decided in this case they needed to not let Reverend Martin have a little wedding and funeral business on the side for his own pocket. You see how people turn to say, well, where can we recover something? Who has a sideshow going on? Where is something unfair going on? Life went on in the neighborhoods. Holland Museum has great photos of this era, so you can get an even more interesting feel of what happened in Holland in that period of time. Tulip time continues. And yes, 1929 did affect the lives of ordinary people whose families were not in stocks. Does anybody have an idea what a home cost in the 1930s in Holland, Michigan? What did a house cost back then after the crash? Could you buy a house in Holland for maybe 10 or 15,000 at that time? And then did this part of Michigan have resilient businesses? Well,
I don't know about the cost of a house, but I know what rent, and this is not an apocryphal story, but my parents with their two oldest children changed apartments in the 10th or to 12th Street area between Central and College, and they moved because the new apartment had a rent of $4 a month instead of $6 a month.
oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. But you know, that really is believable. I mean, we with our experience, if you think back, if everybody will think back to what an ice cream cone cost when you were 5 to 10 years old, what did a nice double dip ice cream cone cost when you were between 5 and 10 years old?
5 cents.
Me too.
No,
Hudson, New York, 5 cents, a perfect and a really good ice cream too.
the double dip in Holland was 10 cents. When it's about 1944.
Yep, in the 1940s. Okay, 5 to 10 cents. And what are we paying today at Holland's better ice cream establishments?
3 1/4, 3 1/2.
Yep. Okay, 1 solid hour of babysitting with, let's say, 3 kids, one of whom is a rascal. What are you going to be paid for your 1 hour of babysitting in the 40s and 50s in Holland?
In Wisconsin, it was 15 cents an hour or 25 cents an hour before midnight, and I think 35 cents after midnight, something like that. in the mid 50s.
Okay, more after midnight. Okay, and I was in Holland in the 50s, and I babysat for the Hope College professor who lived across the street. 50 cents an hour for the 3 kids. So 50 cents an hour, and I guess by the 50s, the ice cream cones were more than that. But my sister has in some of her in her article on this, that you could buy a nice lady's dress downtown for $4 to $6 in the 30s. Well, wow. If a month's rent was $6, how could a dress cost $6? But what are we pointing out here? We forget of the effect of inflation and what it really meant, how the money was different. I mean, if for what we're talking about right now, a salary in the 1920s for a minister who's supposed to be not getting into the ministry for the wrong reasons, such as being paid a lot, would be having $6,000 a year. And then on top of that, there's a free parsonage. That's quite a bit of money compared to what we're talking about in the 30s. My grandfather, Walford, in Williamson, New York, had his salary reduced to $1,000 a year. $1,000 a year, when my father and his sister were both hoping to come to Hope College the following year. And it's just hard to imagine. You can never evaluate these things without knowing what the whole picture was, what the different societies were. Look how those boys in this picture are dressed. Who wears a tie while he's playing outside? They probably got dressed up for this picture. Okay, next slide. Now, here are 3 books. I just threw this in here because in the New York Times last week, there was an article about here's John Calvin, and believe it or not, that's Arminius right there. How many of you have ever heard of the dreaded Arminians? And Arminians are not people who live in Armenia. Who are the dreaded Arminians? Well, they're the people who were being accused of something at the Synod of Dort, but we don't need to get into that. There's John Calvin right in the book section of the New York Times last year. And here's a new book on the roots of capitalism and the nature of economic activity, or capitalism and the Protestant ethic. The most famous book on that topic of, kind of our history, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, written in 1930. And Benjamin Friedman, this is the new book that was reviewed last week, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. It doesn't sound like a very good book to me. Those of you how many of you are interested in this, kind of sometimes read in this area, relationship of religion and capitalism? Okay, I read this article and I didn't think either Friedman or the guy who was reviewing it knew what they were talking about when they were talking about Calvinism. I thought it was kind of an off-the-wall article. But every once in a while, you see the assertion that capitalism and Calvinism are closely related, in either whether they're praising them both, criticizing them both, or whatever. Next slide, we'll move on. But there are 3 books that Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds starts with the tulip mania that took place in the Netherlands that we mentioned last week. Now, in the aftermath, we're getting into the chapters that we discovered this week. We mentioned that there were fewer suicides than people think, and embezzlement, the effect of the crash on embezzlement was more significant than on suicide. Galbraith points out that we have embezzlement in all periods, in good times and bad. What is embezzlement? It's employee stealing money from his employer, as I understand it. He believes that it's in hard times that people become vigilant, but that embezzlement is actually just as common in good times as in bad. And that the mood becomes more strict, more judgmental, more who's cheating me, how am I being cheated, where are the culprits? In any aspect of society, this mood takes over in hard times. And there's a reflection in churches. As I said, I know the history of, and Judy Parr knows the history at Hope. And both of us have seen that in the Depression, there was a mood in the church of being much more judgmental and finding the culprits and so forth. the slightest membership drop will be blamed on the minister and so forth. And poor Reverend Martin, who had been so popular in the 20s, was practically driven out of the church in the 30s as everything turned against him. Hoover cut taxes, but the cut only helps the rich, page 137. Have you ever heard of that before? 136 and 7, the no business meeting is hilarious, as Galbraith describes the nature of the no business meeting, which is strictly for photo ops and nothing really happens. It's just public relations. Market drops continued through June 32, despite many more efforts at reassurance. And page 143, one can always blame the Democrats if you run out of reasons or if reassurance fails, and hilarious efforts to blame the Democrats for the crash. Next slide. Now, in the early 30s, Congress was in a mood to find some culprits and put them in jail. And he tells the story of Richard Whitney, who was sent to Sing Sing for his embezzlement activities in the course of trying to get himself out of trouble in the panic. And then he compares him to Alger Hiss, a later scapegoat that Congress selected. And it's interesting that Galbraith pauses to tell the story of Richard Whitney and some of the other high-profile bankers who were up to no good. Neither of these convictions, says Galbraith, shows that the friends and associates and contemporaries were doing the same crimes. The scapegoat is a scapegoat because he represents a whole class of people. It's a simplified effort to find someone on whom to pin the blame. And Galbraith insists that crime or even misbehavior is the act of an individual, not the predisposition of a class. Do you feel that throughout this book, Galbraith is trying to calm everybody down and illustrate that in general, the banks behaved well and most businesses and corporations behaved well, and particularly that the New York Stock Exchange was not an institution that you can blame or vilify for its behavior or its responses to the crash? Do you feel that Galbraith is rescuing the reputations or overcoming the cynicism of the New Deal and of that whole era of the 30s and 40s about the stock market and bankers and who's at fault when things go bust? He points out that Congress did form laws to correct the worst elements of 1928 and 29. And to enforce these, the Securities and Exchange Commission was formed, which does still today have authority over the markets. As we all know, Janet Yellen was called in a couple of weeks ago to have this big meeting with the Federal Reserve to discuss GameStop and all this hullabaloo about the bubble market in GameStop. And did Janet Yellen end up doing a lot of yelling? Did she come in and start yelling at all the people who had done something wrong to create this bubble where a lot of hedge funds lost some money temporarily and so forth? What did you notice about the big meeting? Was it one of those non-meetings where Janet Yellen got together with people and they all agreed it was very complicated and needed to be investigated, but nothing happened? I think yesterday in this past week, there already was a new congressional hearing on all the GameStop bubble discussion. And senators were making a display of yelling at different representatives who were coming in to testify what happened. But what will come out of that is still to be known. But going back now to the congressional response in 1932 to 34 to what had happened are these 6 points that were part of the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 and 1934 in two versions, in other words, or in two steps. Full disclosure required, though no one can make you read everything that you get. Probably you could have quite a bit of money in the stock market and you've never really read every single word of those disclosures that you receive in the mail. Inside deals, in other words, within a company, making short sales of the company of which you are an employee or owner, are prohibited. the Federal Reserve gains the right to fix margin requirements up to 100% margin. In other words, wiping out margin trading entirely. Now, what if Janet Yellen had come in and started yelling and saying to the banks, well, that's it. I'm sick of all this trouble coming out of this margin selling, and I'm wiping out margin trading today entirely. Would she ever do that? Absolutely not. That would be the very quickest thing she could do to take something that's a small bubble over here in somebody's backyard of a bubble bursting and people losing money and creating a market effect that would be drastic if suddenly the federal government came in and said, that's it with margin trading, everybody pay up right now. The entire market would completely be destroyed in just a few days. Number 4, pool operations, wash sales, never mind, that's a type of sale. Tips or clear falsehoods to rig or manipulate are prohibited. These are all sort of common sense, but they hadn't before 1933-34. They had not been stated and enforceable by the federal government. Prior to 1933-34, it was just assumed that the New York Stock Exchange had a right to regulate itself by these principles of good behavior, and that it should be and it would be in their paperwork. But now this layer of federal enforcement was forced upon the New York Stock Exchange and all exchanges of that type. More importantly, the New York Stock Exchange and other exchanges were subject to public regulation, and the SEC was established. The principle that the government has the right to step in and control or regulate markets was hard fought. Now, are there comments on that as a balance of when does the public interest become so important that the federal government can come in and tell the market makers what to do? Let's take the next slide. That's a huge question, of course, and it has to be specified before you can give any answer. Okay, that's the last slide. I think that was the last slide. Okay, folks, other comments about these chapters, ending with the SEC.
I have some questions in the chat. Linda, do you want those?
Yes, yes.
Okay, let me start at the top. From Chester, please comment on the relevance of the no business meeting on page 139 today, where devotees rely on the exchange of ideas justification. Maybe you did that, I don't know.
Okay. The no business meeting, Galbraith says, became a staple. I mean, all government entities make sure that there are meetings of federal dignitaries, from the president on down, that appear in the paper, and so met, this conference was held, where it becomes a method of PR and reassurance. It's another way of creating public confidence that yes, someone is in charge, or yes, these people are meeting, yes, this is being addressed, when it is basically PR. Is he making fun of no business meetings? Well, how many people have ever worked for a big company or a small company where there's certainly way more meetings than there need to be? Okay, or things that could be simply taken care of, where someone who should be in charge of something should just be in charge of it, not call a meeting of 6 people to come in and toss ideas around before that same person makes up his or her mind what they're going to do. And it's kind of a pretense. So what's the quickest way to solve the problem of too many meetings? Well, there is no quick way. When you're employed,
Have another meeting to discuss the meetings.
Sounds
okay,
like church.
sounds like church. Okay.
I mean, if you really expect a business to be run on the basis of consensus, you're going to have lots and lots of meetings. that the result is only an action to continue discussing the subject.
Exactly, exactly.
I
That's
was in
my,
a church where someone said, we are over committed and under committed.
that's a good phrase. That's a good phrase. My husband used to say, I never heard of a consistory meeting that took less than 2 hours. So,
Next,
okay,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry. Next
Go-
question was, does the Texas debacle support the comment that regulatory bodies have a marked life cycle, either an arm of the industry they regulate or senile?
Okay, I'd like to hear some comment on that. My comment on that is that what Texas did was to completely cut off their energy system from any other state. It's like, well, they could borrow some power from Arizona or bring it in from Oklahoma, but no, that's not happening. Texas doesn't want anybody messing with they created their Texas only energy system because they didn't want the federal government coming in and telling them what to do with their energy policies. They didn't want any regulation or control. And the only way the Fed has control is by arguing that it's interstate. And so, okay, it's Texas only. So now Texas legislators only decide whether they're going to winterize their systems or not. And we don't want to mess with that. It hasn't happened for a long time. And we don't need to provide for these lines and these towers to all be, all these pipes to be insulated. It's not going to happen for another 15 years. So they didn't put the money in. And now they don't want big government coming in to tell them what to do. But when it goes bust, boy, do they call FEMA in a hurry. Now they want the president to appoint a commission and send all this equipment, all this, now they want big government. So this is the conundrum that we get into with federal regulation to prevent things that are foreseeable. And Texas says no. And now I wonder, it'll be interesting to see whether in some way the federal government now forces Texas to provide winterizing protection so that people don't die. And so that FEMA doesn't have to create a massive national emergency inflow. This was not an unexpected flood or hurricane act of God. This was an act of man by not insulating all those pipes. Other comments on the Texas disaster from all of you?
So one of the things that I would say is that they had a disaster back in 2011, and they had a commission that studied and said, you need to make these improvements in the grid, and nobody did anything about it.
Nobody did anything about it. Okay.
I was surprised at how far back that this all took place, that started prior to World War II, according to what I read in the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 1930.
1930 that they had a previous disaster in Texas?
No, 1930 is when they said we're not going to participate in the
Oh, I see.
in the grid. They wanted to be separate, and
Right.
I don't know the process, but that's when they went off on their own.
Yeah, they didn't want to share any of the energy that they had in Texas with Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico.
Wow.
How did the certain areas avoid it though? Because there's certain areas in Texas that were on a grid that integrated.
Okay.
In El Paso, which is in the corner of New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico, is on the grid, and so they were unaffected. They're on the western grid, and so they were unaffected.
Okay.
It was my understanding from something that I read, and I cannot explain this because I'm not good enough to, but the pricing structure was also part of the problem because they priced energy to favor large corporations and in effect harm the individual homeowner. But I read that, but I that's all I know.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, there is something about the free market pricing there, but I don't know the details.
Was there any relationship with Enron? I believe that was a Texas-based energy company. Would that fiasco that related to this issue as well? Anyone know?
I don't really know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one either. I don't think so, but I don't know.
The answer is no.
No, there was no direct connection with Enron to the crisis in Texas right now. Certainly, the federal government was involved in the 1930s in the Rural Electrification Act, providing the money for utilities to bring electricity out to the hinterlands where, you know, maybe even in the 40s in downstate Ohio, there were rural areas that didn't have electricity on the farm yet. So the federal government steps in to make it possible to initiate all that service from which then the utility companies are going to make all this money. So it's kind of, I want you when I want you. And when things are good, just get out of my way. And when things are bad, please come and rescue me. So
My parents had a farm in rural Wisconsin in the early 40s that was not electrified. We had kerosene lamps. There was a well with a cistern. My mother had a wood cook stove. My grandparents had a farm down the road and they had their own windmill to generate their electricity. So this was pretty much, this was in central Wisconsin. You're about 40 miles from Appleton. Probably until 1945, they didn't have electricity at that point.
absolutely, I hear you, Sue. And where I taught in east of Cincinnati near the Appalachian district, I knew adults my age who had grown up in houses that still had outhouses. They didn't have plumbing out there, didn't have indoor water supply. So it's amazing what level of what we think of primitive conditions there were in rural areas, and maybe still are. In very mountainous areas like West Virginia, there are areas where it's almost impossible to get a water supply to certain places. So the good old windmills have to still do a lot of work, don't they?
Still that way on the Navajo reservations in New Mexico and Arizona.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see, the next question was, wasn't there a difference in banking between federal and state banks? I remember my dad and mom saying they did not trust any of the state banks back in the 20s and 30s. Plus, I understand in the urban areas where an early form of credit unions were being operated, the customer fared a whole lot better, kind of like reflected in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Is this a correct understanding?
Oh, that's good. Well, I'm not the expert on that either. I do know that the savings and loans came up as an alternative to what they thought of as the big banks, and the credit unions were trying to create a more local bank. But if you're right, then people tended to want that federal backing that state banks.
Well, Linda, there were federally chartered banks and state chartered banks.
Okay. Okay, so states certainly would claim and have the right to charter banks and to oversee their own banks.
Are there any other states that have their own grid now other than Texas? And will they learn something from this?
No, there's 3 grids in the country. There's the Eastern grid, which is roughly east of the Mississippi. There's the Western grid, and then there's Texas. Canada has its own grid.
Okay.
So,
okay.
So thinking back to 2003, August 15, 2003, there was a massive collapse of part of the grid that serves us. Remember when it shut down a huge region of the country? So then Texas could have their own grid go down, but it wouldn't affect any larger region than Texas, I guess.
well, I'll get started here. So the electrical system is very, it's a balance. You can't have more demand than you have generating capacity, and you can't have more generating capacity than you have demand. So the people that operate the grid are constantly bringing power online and taking it offline to balance against the consumer, industry, residential demand. So it's a very dynamic system. And what you're talking about actually originated in the start of the problem originated in Ohio, and it was a utility down in Ohio that didn't do proper maintenance of their right-of-way of their cables. A major transmission line sagged, overheated because of related issues of lack of maintenance, went down and hit, I can't remember, a tree or something. And once it did, things started going offline, and they lost control of the balance, and it percolated its way. It stopped West Michigan in the Campbell plant. I don't know the specifics, but they made some decisions that caused it to stop before it got all the way to the shore of lake to where we live. But anyhow, the study of how the grid works is, I've read a lot of books about it, and it's a very interesting challenge to manage it. But they've gotten better since that experience in 2003. They've made a number of improvements in terms of how things are managed, so to prevent that from happening. So again, it's a long topic.
It
I
sounds
thought the
like-
Canadian grid was involved too.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of that one. It's been a while since I've read the details, but they were
And New
partially
York was
affected.
involved in one.
Say it again?
And New York was involved in it too. It
Oh, very
involved
much
the
so.
Canadian grid too. When
Very
the,
much so, because that's all part of the Eastern
Okay.
grid, and it's sort of the northeast portion of the Eastern grid was what was affected in that.
Yeah, and as the domino, exactly, and as the domino effect, as the grid tried to come in and repair itself and bring everybody back up to power, it would go down. And up in the northern New York, New England, their grid was somehow connected with the Canadian maritime provinces, and it started the same domino effect up there.
I nominate David Couch and D.L. Wernette to develop a HASP class on this issue. It would be terrific, and you would just be really good at it, I can tell. I think it'd be interesting.
It's a very interesting topic. I mean, they talk about renewables and so forth, and they talk about the different types of power plants, and some power plants can respond and increase or decrease their generating capacity in a very dynamic fashion. Others take longer. And so you have to have a mix of the different types of, at least in today's grid. The big issue is there is no storage capacity, and they're experimenting, and they're now starting to bring online some battery storage. That's a big thing with renewables, of course, with solar and wind. But the large scale batteries is a huge area of development. And once they can get that in place, the whole balancing act on the grid becomes much easier because there's storage capacity. The fact there isn't now is why you always have to keep things in balance.
Yep.
who was involved in the grid organizations? Was it federal and state combined and business, or just the federal? How did the grids get set up initially?
It's, well, that gets into a big topic too, but there is, I can't remember the acronym for the agency, but there is an agency. I can't remember the electrical, I can't remember I apologize if I say something, it'll be wrong. But anyhow, there's an agency that is responsible for the standards that the grids follow, that the operators follow. And then there's a management organization, a management hierarchy, some control centers that coordinate and provide this balancing service across the grid. And it is a federally operated organization, and all the utilities participate with that organization.
Yeah, I actually read an article this morning from a Texas paper that said that the grid operators took things offline just before things really got bad, because if you have the imbalance of the demand or the power coming out, it can burn up the plant and just take the whole thing offline and really create a lot of damage. So said they really did a good job taking things off, even though it took a lot of people out of power. At least it didn't totally damage the power plants in themselves. So anyway, it was really a difficult problem. And anyway, at least it could have been a lot worse than it is. If the power plants had burned up, it would take forever to get them back online, and they were able to save that. So anyway,
yeah, that's all part of that balancing act. And that's what they talk about, rolling blackouts. nights is they'll do rolling blackouts because they don't have enough generating capacity. And so they sort of, so everybody gets a little time for their refrigerators or heating or whatever. They'll shut off sections to balance the demand versus the generating capacity. Doing some work with some folks in South Africa, and they actually have a rolling scheduled outage, like an hour a day or whatever. And then there's unscheduled, but anyhow, they have a capacity, a generating and demand capacity problem there. So that's why you hear about that in California, different situations.
Well, look at all the interest there is in this topic, David. You really should develop a HASP class on it. I see it, I envisioned it coming. It would be, look at all the people in our group here who know something about it and have an interest, and we certainly all have an interest.
I'll add that to my list. I spend most of my HASP class working on computer-related technology, but I'll think about that. It's interesting. It'd be fun, I'd say. It's always been an area of interest for me.
Yes, there was a presentation, was it in HASP?
I believe so.
Putting solar power on your roof and discussing, the different ways of not only being self-sustaining in
Yes.
energy in your home, but being able to sell it back to the grid and actually have an income from your solar on your property. And people are interested. Okay, anything else on the chat that we can touch on?
Just a comment that the US inflation calculator says $6,000 per year in 1929 would be $91,000 per year in 2021.
Okay.
And just a note that pastors also often got a house back in that time.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
And that brings us back to one of the main reasons that participation in the stock market and the stock exchange, directly or indirectly, I think is important for the American public, because remember that little joke we told about the two hunters and the bear in the beginning? Well, the bear that's chasing everybody is inflation. And this is what we're illustrating right here, that $6,000 in 1929 was equal to $91,000 today. Does anybody want to share what was paid for your first salaried job back in the 60s?
$3.95 an hour.
200 a year.
Okay. My first job teaching college full-time was $6,000 a year.
I was teaching in high school for $5,000 in '63.
Okay, and I worked as a nurse in Wesley Memorial Hospital in Chicago for $385 a month. And my first job as a nurse's aide in Racine was 92 cents an hour with a split shift, 7 to 12 and 4 to 7, and had a bus ride in between in order to get down to the hospital, about a 20-minute bus ride. That cost me, I think it was, I don't know, 15 cents or whatever to take the bus. So it almost took 50 cents or $1 to get to that 92 cents an hour job.
Man, okay, so to balance that, Sue, I'm going to tell you what the beginning nurses make at the hospital where John was involved, Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey. A nurse starting there starts at $75,000, and many of the nurses make over 100. Yeah. Which, I'm not against that. I don't think that's some horrible thing. I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
So I'm curious if those starting salaries you guys were talking about at the beginning of your careers, did that generally include any sort of health benefits or anything like that, or not? Or would that have been a separate expense for you?
No, the college job that I had did include benefits. You had a health plan and you were contributing to a retirement plan, but there wasn't any benefit like a minister has a house. Usually at that time, a minister is getting a house plus his $6,000, but still.
Actually, Wesley Hospital had I lived at 201 East Delaware in Chicago, which is right near the John Hancock building, for $65 a month. It was a 1-bedroom apartment that was furnished with maid service and linens. So that was really, and telephone. The only caveat was that you could not have any young men to your apartment after 10 o'clock at night.
So, well, that sounds like Hope College.
I mentioned my first salary was $4,200, but that's cheating a little bit. I was a pastor and had free housing in the parsonage.
Free housing, okay. All right.
Me.
Any other questions in the chat?
No,
I would like to see pictures that you did just before the last one.
Oh.
An image of that again.
Okay, can we go back to that? Susan, can we go back to the PowerPoint for a minute?
The picture of the little boys?
No, don't want the little boys. I want the one that was with the book in it, about the book.
Oh, okay, the list of 3 books. Okay.
Right.
The one thing that we didn't talk about is I owned bonds. I owned GM bonds when GM took the Tarp loan. And what happened there is you got $1 on the 1%, I guess, on your bonds. And I made the mistake of cashing in my bonds instead of turning it into stock. But if you were a bond owner and the company went bankrupt, and I had Chicago Tribune, Sam Zell in Chicago bankrupted that company. So bond owners got nothing. It's just interesting if you actually own bonds and things go bust, it's the individual person does not do well.
There was another thing that had about the book itself, book we're reading. And I don't know whether it's just before this one or just after this one.
That referred to another book?
It referred to the book we're reading right now.
Yes.
Not that one. That's the one. Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're just about out of time, and I wonder if Linda would like to give us a preview of what we should look for or what we should be thinking about for our discussion next week, which will be the last one.
Next week is our opportunity to look back and look forward and sum up and spend more time on the question of what does Galbraith think are the warnings that can be taken from what he has said, and what can be taken as the affirmations of things are right with our system. And just so we have a shorter reading, but a more introduction of relationships to today. And then if you did not read the first time, the foreword that was written by James, I think Diana said you thought that was a particularly interesting essay. Now that you've read the book, it might be interesting to go back to the introduction that was written by the younger James Galbraith. I think that's what you meant, Diana. Both the foreword and the introduction, look back at that and be thinking about some of the questions that we've raised. Are there enough restraints? Are there too many restraints? Is government interference needed more? And then the related question, where do we stand in our culture on financial literacy? What would financial literacy be? And what are the most important things that the young generation who are now our grandchildren or young people in their teen years and coming through college and everything, what is it they need to understand to be able to maneuver through life? And then a bigger question about everybody takes a lot of risk all the time. Every decision you make in life involves a road not taken, and the world is full of failure. What percentage of new businesses that start fail? Out of every 4 businesses that are started with hope and expectations and people investing what they can borrow or what they have, out of every 4, 3 will not be there anymore in 5 years. They go down. That's the way it is. So here we have the American culture that's constantly trying things and experimenting. If we believe in if at first you don't succeed, try again, does that mean fail at the same thing repeated times? One definition of stupidity is someone who does the same thing over and over again, even though you bash your head against a wall every time. So what is that mix? And when you think about how many of us ever bought a house that didn't go up, it went down. I did. How many ever bought something that was one of the worst decisions of your life, where you really paid a price for a decision that you made? But the thing is, there's always tomorrow, and there's hopefully in our system, there are certain things that can soften the blow when we have all these failures, and that let people pick up again and, all right, gather your forces. So adapting to risk in the culture, and what is there an implicit praise or critique of capitalism, of our system in this book that's implied. Capitalism is sometimes under attack. And what is capitalism? I mean, I think we all have some idea what is meant by that. And then I also would like to start next week with just a little quiz, if you would be interested in this, about just a little quiz. Like, for example, I'll give you one question right now, which you can come back with your answers next week. Okay. This is just two little examples, and you can give me the right answer. First of all, a deck of cards that was well shuffled is put down on the table face up. The first 7 cards that show up off of your deck are all red. What are the chances that the next card will also be red of your 52 cards? So that's number 1. And you have 3 choices. Number 1 is the same as if no cards had been dealt. The second one is very lightly less than 50-50, and then giving a reason. And then C, there is still, however, a totally random series on the next flip. Okay, that's question 1. The deck of cards, 7 cards are out, they're all red. What are the chances that the next one will be black? Next question. A coin is tossed for the 9th time. 8 of the first tosses were heads. What are the chances that the next toss will be tails? And then you have 3 choices. The same as if no tosses had been made, still 50-50. B, very slightly higher for tails to come up. And then C, a very good bet that the next toss will be tails. Want to answer that now, or do you want to wait and think about it?
I also got one additional question. I don't know if you want to take it now or next week, but from Marilyn, what inflation can we expect from the government support we are receiving during the pandemic?
Okay, that is very good. And let's take that next week. There are a few comments that Galbraith makes, and we can keep that in mind for next week, because we do realize that one of the reasons that you don't put your money under a mattress and just wait for it to be good. Like if you had you're alive in 1965 and your rich uncle leaves you $10,000 and you just think this is an incredible, unbelievable fortune. So you put it in a box, you hide it in a safe place, and you say, I'm going to wait 40 years and then pull out my $10,000. Very bad. Very bad, because your money lost purchasing power. Money is only its purchasing power. Money doesn't mean anything until you buy something with it. I mean, in a way. So it's the purchasing power, and inflation affects that inevitably as time goes by. The other thing we might think about for next week, though, there is such a thing as deflation. Look that up and think about it. What is deflation? And could we ever have deflation plague the country in some ways? If you don't mind, how many of you think it would be interesting to discuss a few situations now, like your uncle leaves you $15,000. What are you going to do with it? And some different opportunities like that. Just do some kind of problems that reveal how we think about taking risk and making investment, what goes into an investment, and what is financial literacy with our system. I'd like to do a little bit of that next week if we have time. All right, so that'll be that. Thank you, everybody. It was a very interesting discussion today, and lots of knowledge and thinking are going into this. So I think it's an interesting thing to hear from all of you.
You flickered the one I wanted to see. The last one you did was a flicker of it, and I didn't get to capture it.
Well, we'll take it up next week. And thank you, Linda.
Okay, you mean you wanted to see that slide again? Someone
Yeah,
whoever,
the very last slide you did.
the very last slide, okay.
Yeah, because it popped up and I said, well, that's the one I want. And then all of a sudden it was gone.
Oh, okay. Susan, can you put that last slide up again as everybody takes their farewell?
It's Kim, but yes, hold on.
Okay.
Is this it? Hold on,
Seeing nothing.
hold on. This one?
No, it had more writing in it.
Okay,
That wasn't the last one. That is
Oh, the last one of the presentation?
that one.
okay.
Linda, the comment you made a few minutes ago reminds me of my brother-in-law moved into my husband's grandfather's house when his grandpa died with his fiance, and then they got married and lived in that house for a couple of years. And they did some remodeling of it. And when they pulled up the linoleum in the kitchen, they found $100 bills
Oh my gosh.
under the linoleum.
Floor. See, it's like you go through life and your stash is hidden somewhere. Where did I put that again?
Yeah, it kind of made them want to remodel the whole house to see if they found anything else like under, other places. But, and my dad is a big cash carrier. And he just has wads of cash all the time. He doesn't ever use checks or anything like that. And so I know that if anything ever happens to him, the first place that we should check and the last thing we should donate are his socks, because he is known to hide wads of cash in his socks. It's crazy.
Boy, I guess you could just go to the Salvation Army and look in the pockets of every single pair of pants and everything that's,
Yeah.
you never know what you would find.